All right, A&P1 students, in this video we are going to talk about the exocrine glands that are part of the skin. So let me go to our objectives, and we're here at 15 and 16. So 15 is, I kind of added this one in, so since we're talking about exocrine glands and we haven't really talked about endocrine glands, so I wanted you to know the difference between them. I don't think this learning objective is actually in this chapter, but I think it's important to understand the difference between these two before we start talking about exocrine glands in the skin. There's two major types of glands in the body, exocrine glands or endocrine glands. And so the exocrine glands, it's just kind of where they secrete their substance is why they're different. So if we have an exocrine gland, their substance that they secrete goes into a duct, which is like a little tube, and then that tube or duct will eventually lead out onto the surface of the skin or another epithelial surface like the ones that line our digestive and respiratory and urinary systems. So those are considered exocrine glands, and we're going to talk about those in the skin. And the endocrine glands, when they secrete a product or a substance, they don't have a duct. Their product goes directly into the bloodstream, and then the blood carries it to where it needs to go. So it goes to different parts of the body. These endocrine glands, we won't talk about them much until we get to A&P2, and we'll talk about the endocrine system, and that's where all of our endocrine glands are where we'll learn about them. So like thyroid gland and adrenal gland, those are all considered endocrine glands. So we're going to jump back to our skin and talk about the exocrine glands that are present in our skin. So we're going to talk about sebaceous glands and sweat glands. And there will be two types of sweat glands and just one type of the sebaceous glands that we'll talk about. All right, so here is our skin picture, and kind of highlighting, making the sweat gland stick out a little bit more here with its color. So there's the sweat gland. Remember, it has a duct system. That's the duct system. And then the product, which is sweat, will be released onto the surface of this epithelium, which is our epidermis here, surface. Then the other type of sweat gland, we call this one a merocrine sweat gland. We also have an apocrine sweat gland. So this is also a sweat gland, and it also has a little duct system. And sometimes that sweat will go to the surface, or sometimes it'll actually connect to the hair follicle too. So we'll talk about the difference between those two. Oops, there's that one there. And then the other type of exocrine gland is the sebaceous gland, and so you can see one here, and then you can also see one here where they've cut it in half, so you can see the little cells that make up that sebaceous gland. So those are the three that we're going to learn more about and understand. We start with our sweat glands. So there are two types, like I said, merocrine and apocrine. And they're, again, both located in the dermis, and they have that little duct that transports the secretion, which is sweat, to the surface of the epidermis. And then again, the apocrine ones generally will connect to the hair follicle, so their sweat will go into the hair follicle, and then once it goes into the hair follicle, then it can travel to the epithelial surface from there. All right, so we're going to talk about these two types of sweat glands. Something that they have in common is they both are going to release a product called sweat. The products that they release, though, are composition-wise, what they contain is a little bit different, and so that's important to know. And their location in the body is also a little bit different. The merocrine sweat glands, these are the ones that you can find everywhere in the body. So they're going to be the most numerous of our sweat glands as the merocrine type of sweat glands. And then another thing that will differ between our sweat glands is the function of the sweat glands. So the major function of our American sweat glands is what we usually think of when we think of function of sweat glands is thermal regulation, which is body temperature regulation or body temperature homeostasis. And remember, that's because the sweat is released and it evaporates from the surface of the skin and takes a lot of heat with it to help lower our body temperature back into a normal range. So the American sweat glands kind of located everywhere. They're widely distributed throughout the skin, and they are mainly involved in keeping our body temperature where it needs to be by releasing heat. And it's mostly made up of water, but we do have other products, solute substances in the sweat gland, and it kind of varies on how much and what those products are. So there is besides thermal regulation, there is a couple of other functions that the American sweat glands provide for the body. So obviously it's a way to lose some water, because water is mainly what the sweat is composed of, and some electrolytes, so like salt mainly, sodium and chloride. Then some drugs, most of our drugs are eliminated from the body through like kidneys or our digestive system, but the sweat glands, American sweat glands, can also help to release some of that ingested drugs through the skin too. And then they provide protection as well, because that sweat, it not only dilutes things out that are on the surface of the skin, so anything harmful, it would dilute them out, but also has antibacterial substances in them, and even antifungal substances. So when it's on the surface of the skin, there's bacteria on our skin too, and so to prevent that bacteria or microorganisms from going crazy and growing too much, it kind of prevents their growth, and so it kind of has a role in defending our body from possible infections. All right, so those are the American ones. So those are probably the ones that we mostly think of when we think of sweat glands. All right, the apocrine sweat glands, these are the ones that aren't located everywhere. These are only in certain areas of the skin. So think your armpits, which we call axilla, around the nipples, and then in the pubic region and in the anal region. So those are where you can find these type of sweat glands, and they, remember, release their secretions primarily into a hair follicle, and then that sweat will then travel along the hair follicle to come out on the surface of the skin. Okay, so their secretion's a little bit different. It has more proteins and lipids in it, which we didn't have in the sweat from the American sweat glands. And because of that, we have bacteria normally on our skin, on the surface of our skin, so that bacteria will use those proteins and lipids, and they'll break them down. And when they do, there's always like a byproduct, and that byproduct is usually a stinky byproduct. So we'll get that, odor associated with the bacteria breaking down the sweat from the apocrine sweat glands. So that's why we, use deodorant to try to eliminate that that smell, because it's not always the most pleasant smell there is. So, and these apocrine sweat glands are going to become more active, a lot more active. They're still there, maybe not as active when you're young, but definitely once puberty hits, they definitely become more active and stay that way for most of your life. All right, so those are our sweat glands. So you should kind of understand the major role and functions of the American sweat glands and the apocrine sweat glands. And I guess with the apocrine sweat glands, I didn't really tell you about a role or a function. I think they don't really exactly know, but they do have like a scent to them, so they think they have more of a role as a pheromone. It doesn't say that in here. I think they're still the jury's still out on kind of what the major role of the apocrine sweat glands are. So, but I have heard before like pheromones, like that smell for, and since they become active like around puberty, kind of it makes sense that maybe it has something to do with with that pheromone smell and attracting, you know, individuals of the opposite sex kind of thing. So, all right, so that is our sweat glands. So you should know the difference between them and their functions. And then the sebaceous glands, this is the last exocrine gland that we're going to discuss. There is a couple of more, but we'll discuss those more when we get to those body systems. The sebaceous glands, they are the ones that produce the oily or waxy secretion, and they call it sebum. And so sometimes we'll just call it oil because it does have it is an oil-based secretion. And it's usually discharged into a hair follicle, just like the apocrine sweat glands, and then onto the hair itself. So that's why when we look at our picture of our sebaceous gland, it's usually closely associated with the hair follicle, so it's on either side. And so what it does is its main function is to lubricate the skin and the hair. So keep it from drying out, keep it healthy. It also, just like the merocrine sweat glands, have some antibacterial substances, antifungal substances. Sebum has some antibacterial substances in it too, so it helps kind of keep the bacteria in check, keep them from overgrowing. So that is our sebaceous glands. They do get more active at puberty as well, kind of like the apocrine sweat glands. So that's why you see more cases of acne around puberty. We're getting more of the oily secretion from those sebaceous glands, you know, that's on the face, and so it can be on the, you know, other parts of the body too. So we'll talk more about acne. That's one of our skin abnormalities that we'll get into more detail about later on. All right, so that is our exocrine glands, and so I'll see you in the next video, and we'll continue talking about the integumentary system.